Good morning, everyone. We're here for our final Bible study this morning. It seems like it was only yesterday that we started, but here we are. And for reasons I explained at the beginning of the week, the 6 chapters, the 6 stories of Daniel that we're looking at, we're having to squeeze them into 5 slots rather than the 6 that I thought I had to begin with. So today we're going to be looking at chapters 5 and 6. At least that's the plan. I think we can do that. Now, obviously, by putting 2 of these chapters into one session, there are some details that we won't be able to deal with. So many other things we could say. So we're just trying to hit some of the highlights as we come to these chapters. Now, with Daniel chapter 5, let's just take the time to briefly review this chapter. So we've got an idea of the basic building blocks, and then we'll start looking at the details within it. So in Daniel 5, then, the summary of the chapter is basically this, familiar to most people. King Belshazzar holds a great feast, and then he commits sacrilege by using the vessels from the Jerusalem temple. Then mysterious writing appears on the wall. And not for the first time, of course, the king asks his wise men to interpret that writing on the wall. But they're unable to do so. Again, not for the first time in the book of Daniel. But Daniel's able to do so. And the writing on the wall announces judgment on King Belshazzar, and his kingdom falls. That's the summary of the elements in Daniel chapter 5. So let's have a look then at some of the details which help us, I think, to understand the dynamics of this chapter, what's going on, and how it relates to other parts of the book. So, verses 1 to 4, King Belshazzar made a great festival, as we already have seen. And in verse 2, you see the highlighted text there, he brought out for this feast the vessels of gold and silver that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem. So, one thing to begin with, do you remember how this story so far in the book of Daniel, it began at the beginning of chapter 1 with Nebuchadnezzar taking the temple vessels and bringing them to Babylon, didn't it? And now we have Belshazzar bringing those vessels out and using them here. It's a way of saying that this part of the story is coming to an end. So we started with this, and now we have it again in order to say this section of the book of Daniel is coming to a close. But more than that, the significance of what happens at Belshazzar's last feast is not simply a matter that there was a party with plenty of food and drink and so on, but this feast of Belshazzar now has religious significance, because it's not just any party, but they are using the temple vessels from Jerusalem. And then why or for what reason are they using the temple vessels from Jerusalem? If you look at the bottom of this slide, then in verse 4, you see what they do. They drank the wine and they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they have the vessels from the Jerusalem temple, which are vessels which were used in the worship of the God of Israel. And now, with those vessels, they are having this feast, and they're praising the God of Israel, right? No, they're praising the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So what we have here, if you like, is that we have the outward appearance of true religion. The outward appearance of true religion. They've got the vessels from the Jerusalem temple, but they're using it to worship pagan gods. So we have a coming together of elements that don't belong together. The true worship of God from Jerusalem with the worship of these gods. So the term that scholars often use for this kind of thing that happens is syncretism. So it is bringing together foreign elements that don't really belong and putting them together into a kind of a hybrid religious service. However, we've got the Jerusalem temple vessels, and they're being used to praise these gods. But do you notice how the gods are described? The gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, does that sequence ring any bells in your head? That's right, the image of Daniel chapter 2. The same sequence. We've got wood there, which we haven't seen before, but apart from that, we've got gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now tell me about the stone. What does the stone do in Daniel 2? It destroys the image. So the fact that these gods are described using the same sequence of metals as we found in Daniel 2, which ends in judgment. It ends in judgment when the stone hits the image. The echoing of that language here at the beginning of Daniel 5 suggests to us, well, what might it suggest to us? Yeah, it suggests that judgment is about to appear here on this kingdom. So you see the way in which you just reading the text closely, we're reminded of connections with other parts of the book. We'll see whether that, what we've considered there is actually going to be the case. Well, we actually know that that's going to be the case. So, with that in place, with this syncretism, that is the bringing together of elements that don't belong together, and the sort of suggestion of judgment to come, that is when the writing appears on the wall. So let's have a look at that. The fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall. The king was watching the hand as it wrote. So this is the next verse after that one we've just read about the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and so on. Now, when it says the fingers of a human hand appeared, and the king was watching the hand as it wrote on the wall, well, clearly this is not, it says a human hand, but this is obviously more than a human hand, isn't it? And when we look at Daniel, once again, the statement here echoes with other statements, similar statements made elsewhere in the book of Daniel. Let's look at those, see what light it might shed on what's going on here in chapter 5. Remember in chapter 2, now that's significant because you've already told me the connection between chapter 5 and chapter 2, right? The sequence of metals. In chapter 2, a stone was cut out, not by human hands, and it struck the statue on the feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. So the hand in chapter 2 is obviously a divine hand. It's a divine hand of judgment. And the human hand that begins writing on the wall, which is clearly more than a human hand in chapter 5, recalls that judgment on its way. We find other points of similarity elsewhere. For example, in Daniel 8, one of the prophetic chapters, talking about the little horn, it says, "But the little horn shall be broken, and not by human hands." So this is a prophetic chapter, and yet it's recalling the elements of this story that we're looking at now. Also, in Daniel 9, verse 15, "O Lord our God, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand. That's the hand of God. So, chapter 5 says a human hand, yes, but clearly it isn't a human hand. It looks like a human hand, and elsewhere the appearance of a hand is an act of judgment. Okay? An act of judgment or an act of God working, as in 9:15. So things are not looking good for Nebuchadnezzar. Then the queen comes on the scene. Now, when the queen, this is the queen mother, this would be one of the queens of King Nebuchadnezzar, comes on the scene in verse 10, and she speaks to King Belshazzar. Now, she says a number of things, but one aspect of what she says is interesting, in that she provides in her speech summaries of significant events that have happened so far in the book of Daniel. So let's just see how she does that, first of all. So, you see how the queen says in verses 10 and 12, we don't need to read all of it, but the queen said, "There is a man in your kingdom." Remember, the king is trying to find somebody who can read and interpret the writing on the wall. So the queen mother comes in and says, "There is a man in your kingdom who is endowed with a spirit of the holy gods." That's an interesting turn of phrase, because that was used, something very similar, in the previous chapter, in chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar was talking, and talking to Daniel, he says that he is endowed with a spirit of the holy gods. Then lower down, "I know that you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods." So the queen speaks, and it reminds us of what happened in chapter 4, the immediately preceding chapter. We can go back to chapter 2. She doesn't refer to chapter 3, of course, because Daniel isn't present in chapter 3. The relation with chapter 2, though. The queen in chapter 5 says, "Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and diviners." He certainly did. When did he do it? Well, back in chapter 2. The king promoted Daniel and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. So what the queen says recalls what happens in chapter 2. And then she also says something which reminds us of what happened in chapter 1. You see, she says at the bottom there, "This Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar." Now, when did the king call him Belteshazzar? Back in chapter 1. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. So what the queen does when she's speaking to King Belshazzar is she includes elements which amount to a summary of all the events in the book so far relating to Daniel, as if to say, this part of the book is now coming to an end. It's kind of a summary of what has happened so far. We've already got hunches that things are going to end. We've seen that once or twice already. And what the queen says also gives us that idea. So, we don't yet know the interpretation of the writing on the wall, but it isn't looking good for Belshazzar. Let's look at the actual writing on the wall now. Now, the writing on the wall is a little enigmatic. That's why it needs somebody to interpret it. The writing on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin, really amounts to some weights and measures. And so by themselves, the words, the writing on the wall, could mean more than one thing. But Daniel interprets the significance of these words. So let's see what the words mean, and then the significance given to them by Daniel in his interpretation. So we've got the beginning with the word mina. The reality is that is 60 shekels. And Daniel says the significance of that is your days are numbered. So he interprets it to meaning that's the significance of numbered. Your days are numbered. Then tekel, well, that is a shekel. Tekel is a shekel. And Daniel interprets the significance of that as you are weighed in the balance and found wanting. That's the significance of that. And then we have Perez or Parsin, which is half a shekel, and Daniel interprets that as meaning broken and divided. So your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So it's just a list of weights and measures. By themselves, it could mean more than one thing, but Daniel, as a prophet, interprets the significance, and it amounts to judgment on King Belshazzar. The idea of being numbered, the idea of being weighed, is an idiom that occurs in several places in the Bible as an image of judgment. Let's just look at a couple just to remind ourselves that this is, Daniel's interpretation is in line with a general biblical view of God weighing and assessing. One of these Job 31:6. Let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. It's a sense of self-assessment here in the sight of God. Then Proverbs, all one's ways may be pure in one's own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. So that's the idea of what's happening here in Daniel 5. God is weighing the worth, as it were, the spiritual, ethical worth of King Belshazzar. Now, I have a question for you here, because these are the words on the wall. That's how Daniel interprets it. It's an act of judgment, and then judgment falls. We're having to miss out a few things here, of course, but then judgment falls. And in verse 31, the way you translate verse 31 differs between different versions. So let me explain this to you. Then I've got a question for you. In Daniel 5:31, it says, and Darius the Mede, and depending on which version of the Bible you read, Darius the Mede took the kingdom, being about 62 years old, or Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The word kaval can mean either of those. It can mean to take or to receive. So some versions translate it as take and some translate it as receive. Now, from your understanding of the book of Daniel so far, what do you think the more likely translation is? Is it that Darius the Mede took the kingdom, or Darius the Mede received the kingdom? Received the kingdom because the Lord gave the kingdom. God is sovereign. That's one of the themes of the book. So I don't know here whether Daniel is saying, now I hope you people reading this book are alert, because I'm going to use a word where you've got to make a decision. Take or receive. You're on track with me. And I'm glad that you all said receive, because I think that's the case. Yes, he receives it rather than taking it. Now, I'm going to throw one thing in here. This is kind of like just an optional extra. I'm giving this at no extra charge. All right. The rabbis, in looking at the writing on the wall, saw some extra significance. Now, whether it's significant or whether it's just a fortuitous accident, well, I'll leave that to you. I'll just sort of give it, as I said, no extra charge here. Well, those are the verses that we were looking at as well. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, and the God of heaven has given the kingdom. Therefore, it seems that Darius the Mede receives rather than take. But now the writing on the wall, that we have a mina, remember? That's a weight of measure, 60 shekels. We've got a tekel, which is 1 shekel. And then we have parsin or peres, which is 2 halves of a shekel. So we've got 1. And so you add it all up and it comes to 62. So, said the rabbis, that's interesting. Where have we seen 62 before? Well, of course, we've seen 62 here in Daniel 5, verse 31, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. Can that just be a coincidence? He's the only person in the entire book whose age is given. Well, as I said, I'm just giving this as an extra, okay? Is that significant? Maybe it is. It seems perhaps a little bit more than accidental. Anyway, there we've done a quick tour through chapter 5, all right? And we now need to move on to chapter 6. I hope that we'll have time to consider questions and so on chapter 5 as well as chapter 6. But this is what happens when you have to put 2 chapters into one session, all right? Chapter 6. Just to remind you, that's where we are. Once again, let's do a quick summary of chapter 6 so that we know where we are. King Darius, in chapter 6, appoints Daniel to high office. Daniel's professional colleagues plot his downfall. Only worship through Darius is allowed. Daniel continues to pray as before, however, so he ignores that law. Daniel is thrown into the den of lions. That's the consequence, death penalty. And he is miraculously rescued. So that is what happens in chapter 6. We're going to put flesh on those bones in just a minute. Now, here we are in chapter 6, and I think it's helpful if we just take a little time to see where this chapter is actually placed within the stories of Daniel, and it'll act as a bit of a review for what we've done as well. Now, do you remember at the beginning, I mentioned that Daniel is written in 2 languages. So it's written in Hebrew and Aramaic. The Aramaic begins in chapter 2 and goes as far as the end of chapter 7. Now, if we just look at those chapters that were written in Aramaic, that is chapters 2 to 7, and just see how they're put together, this is what we see. We have chapter 2. That was the vision of the 4 kingdoms, Nebuchadnezzar's vision, and the metal kingdoms. In chapter 3, we had a chapter concerning faith tested to death. You remember the golden image? Everybody must bow down to the golden image, and if you don't, you're thrown into a fiery furnace. So chapter 3, faith tested to death. The next one is reluctant. There we are. Chapter 4, we have royal arrogance, humbled. King Nebuchadnezzar stands on the top of his palace and says, "Is not this magnificent Babylon, which I have built?" And we know what happens. He becomes like he's become subservient, acts like an animal for 7 years. In chapter 5, the one we've just looked at, again, royal arrogance is humbled. King Belshazzar thinks he can bring the vessels of the temple out, use them for all kinds of, not just worship, but for a huge feast. And his arrogance is humbled because that is the last night of his reign. Now, we're in chapter 6. Come to that. Chapter 6, we have faith tested to death again. Because here, a law concerning worship is passed. If people do not obey it, they will be thrown into a den of lions. It's faith tested to death. And then finally, chapter 7, which we're not going to have time to look at in detail, we have a vision of 4 kingdoms. Those 4 kingdoms in chapter 7 are represented by 4 beasts. So you see, these Aramaic chapters are arranged either concentrically or as a chiasm. So chapter 2 and chapter 7 match each other, don't they? Okay? Vision of 4 kingdoms. Chapter 3 and chapter 6 match each other, faith tested to death. And chapter 4 and 5, both of them have royal arrogance, which is humbled. So these chapters are arranged in matching pairs. So in chapter 6 now, we should not be surprised if we are reminded of matters which happened in chapter 3. There is a difference, of course, a difference of style, if you like, that in chapter 3, faith tested to death, it was a refusal to commit an act. They refused to bow down to the image. In chapter 6, it's a refusal to omit an act. Daniel refuses to stop doing what he's always been doing. But nevertheless, in both cases, there's a death penalty for those whose faith dictates otherwise. In chapter 6, there's a clear contrast between 2 laws. And there are 2 laws in conflict in chapter 6. One of them is the law of God. The men said, these are those who, you remember, plotting against Daniel. The men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Now, it says something about Daniel's integrity, doesn't it? That if the only possibility to get him concerns the practice of his religion, we can't get him on fraud, we can't get him on anything else, it's just on his desire to worship God. So we have the law of God on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the law of the Medes and Persians. So all the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the councillors, the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance, enforce an interdict, that whoever prays to anyone, divine or human, for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. So we have the law of God versus the law of the Medes and Persians. And so Daniel is confronted with a choice between 2 laws. And he has to choose whether he's going to continue, as he always has, or not. So in a way, we've got a similar challenge as we saw in chapter 1. Where do you draw the line? You're going to draw the line in favor of the law of God or in favor of the law of the Medes and Persians? Now, the law of the Medes and Persians, this is what complicates matters. The law of the Medes and Persians appears to be unchangeable. Because, let's look at other places where this is stated. So here in chapter 6, O king, establish the interdict, sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. So the law of Medes and Persians can't be changed. We see that same point in the book of Esther. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it may not be altered. Can't change it. In Esther 8, verse 8, the second part of that statement, an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. Now, this is a bit of a problem, isn't it? Can the law of the Medes and Persians be changed? Apparently not. What about the law of God? Can the law of God be changed? No. So we've got 2 unchangeable laws. We've got an irresistible force and an immovable object here. So what is going to give? And that's perhaps the main point in this chapter. The unchangeable law of God and the unchangeable law of the Medes and Persians. One of them has to budge. Now, of course, as we know, Daniel makes the decision that it's the law of God that he's going to follow. More on that in a minute. The king, of course, is trapped by his counselors. They have really done this behind his back. He does what he can to try to prevent Daniel from receiving this, the execution, really, in the den of lions. And then Daniel's there overnight. In the morning, the king runs to the den of lions, and then the king. This is just as he is being thrown into the den of lions. I beg your pardon. In verse 16, then the king gave the command, and Daniel was brought and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you." And we might say, deliver him from a den of lions? That's wishful thinking, isn't it? But then we say, deliver. Deliver. Haven't I heard that word before somewhere? In the book of Daniel. And would I have read that somewhere before in the book of Daniel? Where would I have heard it before? In chapter 3. And the fact that we've read it in chapter 3 is no accident. Remember that the design of these chapters, that chapter 3 and chapter 6 form a pair. Chapter 3 was a chapter of deliverance. The king now asks that God may deliver Daniel. So chapter 3 shows deliverance. Could we see deliverance in its partner, chapter 6? Now, in fact, we do. So the king gets to the den of lions, and he calls out to Daniel whether God has been able to deliver him, and Daniel responds that the angel of the Lord came and closed the lions' mouths. You remember that? The angel of the Lord came and closed the lions' mouths. Now, the angel of the Lord is an interesting character in the Old Testament, because in Old Testament texts, they seem to move from the angel of the Lord to the Lord himself and back again very, very easily. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The examples will explain better what I mean. In Exodus 3, Moses is in the wilderness. He is herding the sheep of his father-in-law, and then he sees the burning bush. And there, the angel of the Lord appeared to him. Now, who appears to him? The angel of the Lord. That's clear. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. And when the Lord saw, who saw? The Lord, that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. Who called him out of the bush? God. So we've got the angel of the Lord, God, but there's kind of a fluid movement from one to the other. And that happens several places in the Old Testament. It talks about the angel of the Lord, and before you know it, the Lord himself is there. So just bear that in mind. Another example of this in Judges 6 with Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty warrior." So the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon. And then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours." So the angel of the Lord appears, but then the Lord turns and speaks to him. So he moved from the angel of the Lord to the Lord himself. Now, my point in mentioning this is, once again, there's a connection here between chapter 6 and chapter 3. In chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar looks into the flames and he says to his men, "Did we not cast 3 men into the fire?" And they say, "True, O king." Because it doesn't do to argue with the king, okay? "True, O king." And he said, "But I see 4 men in the flames, and the 4th has the appearance of a son of the gods." So, just as in chapter 3, you have the presence of, well, the angel of the Lord, or the Lord himself, with the 3 friends in the flames, so with Daniel in the lion's den, that matching chapter 6, we have the angel of the Lord, or the Lord himself, with Daniel in the den of lions. So that's another point of connection between these 2 chapters, chapter 3 and chapter 6. What's the consequence of all this? In verses 25 to 27, let's read what Darius says after he realizes now that Daniel has been rescued. "Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language throughout the whole world, 'May you have abundant prosperity. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions.'" Darius's fulsome statement here at the end of chapter 6 recalls the statement he made earlier in the chapter. Let's just compare those 2 statements by Darius. The earlier statement on the left: "The king gave the command. Daniel was brought and thrown into the den of lions. And the king said to Daniel, 'May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you.'" That's what he said in verse 16. At the end of the chapter, this is what Darius says: "I make a decree." You see, the decree recalls the command that he gave earlier. He talks about everybody should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, which recalls your God in the previous statement. Further down, he talks about God, he delivers and rescues because he saved Daniel. That recalls the deliver earlier in the chapter. And finally, the power of the lions at the end recalls the den of lions in the statement earlier. So the repetition of those phrases, I think, is saying to us, please compare what King Darius is doing at the end of the chapter with what he did earlier in the chapter. Now, we can't be absolutely certain about this, but the law of the Medes and Persians that was promulgated earlier was for a period of 30 days. And the impression you get from reading the chapter is that events happen very quickly. So the law is made, Daniel is caught out, and he's immediately thrown into the den of lions, well before the 30 days is up. And the impression you get then is that what Darius says here at the end of the chapter is also promulgated very quickly. Now, if that is the case, and it might well be, you notice that what King Darius does at the end of the chapter there in verses 26 and 27, what he is doing effectively is reversing the previous law that he made. And the previous law that he made was a law of the Medes and Persians. And what did we learn about the law of the Medes and Persians? We were told that it cannot be changed. Well, actually it can, if you have a will to do so. Remember, we had the challenge between the two unchangeable laws in chapter 6. The law of God, the law of the Medes and Persians. As far as Daniel is concerned, the law of God cannot be changed, but it seems probable, I think probable, that what the king is doing then is actually changing the law of the Medes and Persians to show that there's only one law which is actually unchangeable. So, right. We've said a few things about chapters 5 and 6. There are many other things we could have said. But now let's have a look at the sweep of chapters 1 to 6, which is where we've been going through in our studies together. And I want to look at a number of ways in which chapters 1 to 6 anticipate chapters 7 to 12. Or to put it another way, how the stories in Daniel anticipate the prophecies in Daniel. First of all, let's just look at the advancement of Daniel. The advancement of Daniel through these first 6 chapters. So, in chapter 1, Daniel is a captive and a wise man in training. In chapter 2, he becomes a chief wise man. In chapter 4, he's not in chapter 3, remember? In chapter 4, he becomes the king's personal advisor. In chapter 5, he becomes the third ruler in the kingdom, and by chapter 6, the last chapter we've looked at, he's prime minister at the outset, and he's sole administrator by the end, because the king has dispatched the rest of his administrators. So what we get a picture of here is the advancement of Daniel. As we go through the book, he gains in seniority and honor as we go through these stories. But there's an irony in that, because at almost every step of the way, how is it that Daniel is promoted? Well, he's promoted because he resists temptations to compromise his principles. That's how he advances. As he resists the political authority, he receives more authority. In chapter 7, bearing that in mind about Daniel, in chapter 7, it's said of the saints that in verse 27, the kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. These are the saints who have just come through persecution. These are the saints who have had to live according to their principles. And what happens? They are given the greatest honor of all in the kingdom of God. So as Daniel resists temptations to surrender his principles and receives honor, so in the prophecies, the saints, as they resist the power of the little horn and the other powers opposing them, and they receive the highest honor of all. That is to say, Daniel's experience in the stories is a foretaste of the experience of the saints of God in the prophecies. So the stories have prepared the way for what we read in those prophecies. Also, in just an outline here, let's see how, more generally, the stories we've been looking at anticipate the the prophecies. In particular, because I can't do everything here, we'll look at how chapters 1 to 6 anticipate chapter 7. Chapter 7, the prophecy of the four beasts, little horn, and so on. So in chapter 2 there, we read that God is in control over times and seasons. That is what God is in control of, over times and seasons, in verse 21. In Daniel 7, 25 to 26, the power, this is the little horn, is overthrown. Who tries to usurp those powers? It shall think to change the times and the laws. In Daniel 3, all the nations around in the empire, all the nations bow before the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. But in chapter 7, all the nations bow before the Son of Man, the reverse of that. In chapter 4, the king is likened to a beast. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar is likened to a beast. In chapter 7, the kingdoms are likened to beasts. Got a series of kingdoms likened to beasts. In chapter 5, Darius we've got this, is he given power? Does he take power? Well, as we've seen, he is given power. And in Daniel 7, which I'll unpack in just a second, the saints are given power. And in chapter 6, we learn that God's dominion has no end. That's what King Darius says. God's dominion has no end. And in chapter 7, the little horn's dominion comes to its end. God's dominion has no end, but the little horn's dominion does have an end. So there are numerous ways, and these are just a few details, of how reading the stories anticipates what we read in the prophecies, and therefore we make a mistake when we come to the book of Daniel and are interested only in the prophecies. When people come to me and say, I'm really interested in Daniel, and I say, oh, chapter 3. Oh, no, chapter 3. No, I mean the prophecies. We have a whole book of 12 chapters. God in his wisdom gave us the whole book. Therefore, we need to read the whole book and see how it hangs together and how one part informs the other. Our reading and understanding will be enriched, I believe, if that's what we do. Now, just one final verse from Daniel, and this is in verses 26 to 27. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and totally destroyed. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Now, what I want to point out here, you notice that one of the main themes in the stories is that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of this world. The first statement highlighted there is his dominion shall be taken away. His dominion shall be what? Taken. Taken by whom, do you think? Taken by God. The second highlighted statement, the kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Shall be given. Who's going to give it? God. So this statement here is a reminder that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of mortals. He is the one who takes, he is the one who gives. He takes away the persecution and he gives the glory to the saints. Because the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will. Now, I've sometimes struggled to get one chapter into 60 minutes. I managed to get 2 chapters into about 50 minutes. So I've achieved something I thought I might have struggled to do. So we do have a little time now. And what I'd like you to do initially then is just to consider these, if I can get it on the screen, sorry, there we are. Some discussion. The first one, what is the main message that you've derived from studying Daniel 1 to 6? So we've surveyed Daniel 1 to 6. If you had to pick out one thing from that, what might it be? And then whatever it is, you might, if you have time, consider the second one. What relevance does that have for your spiritual life, your personal spiritual life, or for the life of the church in general? Can you, you know the routine by now, all right? Just 2 minutes or so on, 2 or 3 minutes, just discussing that with somebody, and then we'll get some feedback, and then that will bring our week's study to a conclusion, okay? Excited buzz going around the tent once again, right? All right, brothers and sisters, that's all I think we have time for. I forgot to check whether we have somebody with a roving mic. I forgot to check. We do. Oh, right, sorry. So if you would like to briefly just share your responses to those questions that you've been discussing, if you just raise your hand, and then when you speak, if you stand, that will help as well. Okay.
Well, I saw the gospel. Is this on?
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm.
I saw the gospel message for the first time strongly in those chapters. I missed the first few days, but I just see that it's by faith alone can we be saved from adversity and from ourselves and from God's justice. So Daniel was clearly saved. Mm-hmm. The examples are just very, they're incredible. And how God works with us when we separate ourselves from him. He was so patient with King Nebuchadnezzar, and it had to come to a point where he was humbled, and we can't humble anyone, but God can, and he proves that. So, the gospel again, by faith alone are we saved.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, there's another one here.
Honouring God and trusting him is the only way to success.
Okay, thank you. I want to give as many people an opportunity to say something, so I'm not saying anything more myself. This is your summary.
That for Daniel, even though he had lots of troubles, he didn't run away from them. He didn't escape. He engaged academically and in governance with his society. He wasn't an outcast or on the fringe.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
First, I'd like to thank you, Pastor, for this wonderful study. And also, I'd like to say that I've learned so much myself from it, and I think we must never forget as a church that this is a book that is meant to be studied these days, not only for the prophecies, as you say, but for the stories and the revelations. And I think if we look at these stories as you've explained them to us, that there's nothing irrelevant, nothing that we can dismiss and say, that's not relevant for me. But the whole humbling and redemption of Nebuchadnezzar applies to us. And also there's still so much to be revealed in the book of Daniel. And as a church, we should be looking very closely at it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We've got a hand down here in the front, just down here.
Thank you. I just saw that in the book of Daniel, Daniel must have had a great faith, a great relationship with God, and that his faith was on trial. And like many people today, their faith can be on trial. They could be perhaps losing their job if they didn't stand up for what they believed in. But in the book of Daniel, there was people that were going to lose their life if they didn't stand up for what they believed in. And I think that's an example of what will happen in the end as well. And that just shows us what connection we have to have with God.
Okay, thank you. Any, is it one? Oh, okay. There's one over here. We'll try and come.
I just wanted to mention, I like the contrast with the first king, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the King Darius, how King Nebuchadnezzar says gods, like when he talks to Daniel, he says gods, but the King Darius says God. He makes it very known that, I like that. And if we are faithful like Daniel, the same will happen,
Okay, thank you. We've got time for maybe one more.
For me, the lesson from looking across all those chapters is God is the sovereign authority over everything that happens here on earth. And to make it even more personal, he's in charge of my life. And he can humble me if I don't humble like expected.
Okay, thank you. So our time has gone, and I'm sure many more things can be said about these chapters. What I'd encourage you to do is to go back and study and restudy. The Bible in general, is not fast food. It isn't a pot of instant noodles. This is gourmet food, which needs to be take time with it, and you'll enjoy it far more than a gluten Big Mac. Okay. So, just as we conclude, shall we just have a prayer just to conclude? Our dear Lord, we do thank you for your word, for its richness, its depth, for the fact that each time we come to it, we can learn something new and something significant as well. So I pray for all of us here that we may be not only faithful to your word, but that we may take the examples of Daniel and his friends as to what faith in a time when the culture in which we live may be becoming increasingly hostile to faith, how we may have the courage to take our stand and to be a witness. I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Oh, well, Dr. Turner, I just want to say a quick word on behalf of the South Queensland Conference and our camp meeting here. It's been a delight to have you here sharing with us. I mean, we're not quite done yet. You've got tonight and tomorrow in Encounter, but in terms of our study here in the morning, it's been a real blessing, and I just want to thank you sincerely for your... I don't think I'll see Daniel in the same light. I've been here as often as I can, as amongst other commitments, and some insights there that you've brought to light, and it's good for us to dig deeper into God's Word, and just want to thank you in leading us in that process. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Dr. Turner. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. God bless. Thank you.